To join. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councillor, founder of envoPAP, and today we have here Ayo Sokale, who's a very interesting and inspiring individual who has been working across the sustainability and environmental activism, and she's also been a deputy mayor. So, without any further ado, I would like to kick off by getting to know a little bit more about Ayo, and she can give us an introduction about who she is.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So my name's Ayo and my name is Joy. And I think that's a golden thread in everything I do. I try and do things joyfully and have purpose. And I found purpose being an engineer working in flood risk, which is very much linked with climate change because we're trying to protect people from flooding and protect communities. In addition to that, I found purpose being a councillor, where I got to found plastic-free Caversham, which was such an important journey to helping that part of Reading become more sustainable. And we were able to achieve single plastic-free accreditation in 2023, which is incredible. I then gone on to be a deputy mayor, and maybe if you have young children or you know people who have young children, you may have seen me on Get Set Galactic, which is a CBB show inspiring children to be excited about science, technology, engineering, and math, and just learning and trying.
No, I completely agree. And I do feel we should be teaching about climate change in school from a very younger age. And that also starts with less is more. I think that principle could start with as young as 5-year or 6-year olds. But what inspired you, to get into environmental advocacy? As I can see, you're doing quite a bit of it. And what was your main inspiration behind getting into this?
Well, for me, it's always been, I love nature. I love the environment. We have to look after it. It's important for us as human beings. Like, we literally need it to survive. But also, I think I had a pivotal experience when I was younger, where I experienced nature being at its most destructive. I experienced flooding in my parents, where my parents are from in Nigeria, where I lived for 9 years. And that experience taught me that if we don't take precautions and we don't, look after our planet better, our emissions, don't reduce our waste, if we don't design differently, we don't learn to live with nature or adapt to live with nature, then we could be in a really, really challenging place in the future. So I think I saw those things, and I thought, oh, I love nature. If we don't do anything, it'll be destroyed. And then I also saw the destructive element when nature is destructive. And I was like, I need to do something about that. So I think that would probably be the impetus to be so active in this space.
Great that you come from Nigeria. It's an interesting country and an interesting market. We do some business down there, and the focus is changing very fast. We are seeing some great traction in the pharmaceutical sector, as well as certain food packaging, where companies are making that change very quickly. But just a quick one. Do you consider yourself as an environmental activist or an environmental advocate?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because
This is just popped up when you were saying something. I was like,
this is
I need to
such a
ask
good
this.
question, and you actually caused me to pause. Activist is quite a weighted word, and I think I'm a technical person by background, so I have the tools to do something practical. And activism often is something slightly different. I think we think about, Extinction Rebellion, like kind of like guerrilla tactics to get attention on something that is really important. I don't necessarily fit in that space. I'm not part of those organizations. I'm more working within this, the systems of the organization I work for, or the, using schemes like Surface Against Sewers as a great framework to kind of do what I can do. So I think I'm more of a environmental, practical person, saying, what do I have to hand? What skills, knowledge, experience, what tools, where's my sphere of influence, and how can I use all of this to make a tangible difference? I maybe not be railing about it in the way that's a little bit more evocative or emotive, but I'm definitely doing the work. And I think I think being an engineer makes me kind of sit in that doing the work sphere, which isn't quite activism. So maybe we could say advocacy, but yeah, we could say advocacy, but with a practical streak through it. It's definitely a doing streak.
Wonderful. So I was asked this question a few days ago, and that's when I said, I'm an environmental executioner. I'm executing whatever I plan to do. So
Oh, I love
maybe
that. I'm stealing this one, okay? That's mine now.
So that's it might end for you as well. But tell us something which has been very impactful in terms of a project which you led, and it has created not just impact on the ground through the community or a region has been developed, but something where you felt, oh wow, me as Ayo has made a great amount of difference.
I think I always want to take two lenses from this, one being an engineer and then one being someone who works from grassroots community projects. So being an engineer, I've got to work on some major projects, or even being a tiny part of a major project, either from supervising the construction of a reservoir that will protect 275 homes from flooding, to then as a kind of grassroots environmentalist, co-founding the Plastic Free Group, which I did in 2019 and founded then, and then working with the council and working to kind of be part of the Reading climate change strategy and influencing that from a policy level, and then supporting all of our businesses and allies to make that shift, to use less plastic items, to be more sustainable, and to sign up to be kind of allies under the SAS scheme. I think that's been another way of being practically impactful. So I think when I talk about being impactful, it also gives them two lenses: grassroots activism or advocacy or execution, and then also really practical engineering that's actually working with nature, working with the environment to protect and reduce the risk of flooding to communities, or at least increase resilience to those events.
Coming back, because we have listeners from across the world, you mentioned SAS scheme.
Yes, it's Surface
Do you mind
Against
telling?
Yes, of course. So Surface Against Sewers is a fantastic organisation. I guess they're their own charity in their own right, but more than that, they've basically simplified the process of everyone being an environmental executioner. I'm going to steal that phrase. So they basically created guidelines within their website. You can go on it right now, and it creates resources to become a plastic-free school, a plastic-free community, a plastic-free town, a plastic-free council. It gives guidance that anyone from, anyone on the street to, your MP could actively use to take those steps. So it's also making it simple, because not everyone's an engineer, not everyone's an environmentalist. Maybe doesn't everyone runs an environmental focused company like yourself, but everyone wants to know that they're doing something purposeful to help us in this challenge that we're facing. And I think what I love about SAS is that they kind of simplify that. They demystify the work of being an environmental positive person. You're doing something positive to improve where we are as an environment, as a society. And I think that's also really important, because when I go into schools or I do outreach, I often hear about environmental or eco-anxiety, where young people feel really, really anxious about the environment. And I think one way we can kind of curtail that, because I always think anxiety is kind of when you're waiting to do action, is like to have clarity, and SAS give you clarity about an action you can take and at least steps you can take to make a positive change, which I think is just so amazing. I recommend them to anyone else. Go on their website, create your own Surface Against Sewage, community, and just see what you can achieve. Maybe you can get your area of the world, single plastic free accredited. Maybe you can do something even more incredible. Maybe you can change policy. Maybe you can change the world around you in the most magnificent way, but it starts with that little bit of action.
Wonderful. I think you've just given a great direction for the younger crowd to go on to SAS and see what they can work on. Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Ayo. Maybe I would love to direct the conversation from community impact and environmental execution advocacy to something where we both relate to, which is diversion and inclusion in sustainability. And my experience in this has been very mixed, because I've had 9 years in this journey, and sometimes it has been, just bad, and sometimes it has been great. So, as a woman of color, I actually have this question for you in this environmental space. Any specific challenges you have faced, and how did you, come across them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think challenges when it comes to diversity inclusion always kind of factored by lots of things, intersecting identities. So I'm Black, I'm a woman, I work in STEM, I'm neurodivergent, all of those things intersect to create my unique lived experience. And that's the only experience I have. So I can never, say what's normal. I can only say what I've experienced. And I always caveat everything with, it's just my lived experience. So for me, in some of the spaces I'm in, maybe I'm the only person like me there. And that can be interesting because it means either I have to be incredibly perfect because I realize I'm representing everyone that looks like me. If I do it wrong, that means that no one else like me is ever going to be in that room, in that space, in that sphere. And that it's an incredible opportunity, but it's also like a massive weight to hold. And I always think when I look at people who may be more, well, I would say, because I'm a global majority, but maybe if we're talking about in terms of where I live, maybe more the majority where I live, they don't have that weight of expectation. They get to exist. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. If I go down to what is underneath all the challenges I've experienced, the superficial underneath the superficial is actually that I'm holding the weight of representing a whole demographic. I have to be perfect. I'm not allowed just to be normal. I have to be exceptional. I can't get it wrong. And that is probably one of the biggest challenges because it prevents you from taking risks. And I think risk is really important to actually learning and growing. You've got to have space to pivot, get it wrong, iterate, change your mind, do everything differently again. And it's really important for growth. We know that. Scientists, they make hypotheses, they test it, they're like, oh, that's wrong, I'm going to do something else. And that's one of the things I think can be quite negative, and especially in the space where I think it's quite a scientific-based space. You need to have a mind that's allowed to explore options. And if you have that weight of responsibility of representing everyone, because there isn't enough representation, that can be a challenge. It's a fine line in being representation and being a role model and realizing that we just need way more people in the room who are different. And even then, like, we're not going to agree. You can have 3 people who are exactly like me. Maybe they're a Black woman and they're neurodivergent and we won't agree on anything. And that's good. That's actually real diversity. So diversity of thought. So I think underlining all the challenges is that actually weight of being perfect.
Well said. Well said. Does that add more pressure to you?
I think so. I do think it influences the way you do things. I think often you can be surrounded with people who are telling you how to do things. And it takes a lot of confidence, a lot of strong self-concept to actually start doing things because you want to do them or the way that you want to do them. And that's really important because I think in anything, especially more and more as a society today, people want to see authenticity. They want to see people being themselves. But often if you are so used to not being in those spaces or navigating spaces that you're not the majority, you're often assimilating. So you're often being like someone else. Like, I love being in nature. I used to be a National Trust member. I used to always remember every time I spend any time in that environment, I'd be like the only Black person and everyone will be looking at me and I'll be so like conscious that I'm the only one here. So it's that as well. I think it often makes you assimilate and you're kind of dissociating from what your core motivations would be, your core way of behaving. Over time, you wouldn't even know what your natural inclinations would be because you've almost moved away from them so much because you're trying to navigate the space you're in. And of course, there is an element of assimilation that makes sense. Like, we have rules in society, like don't break the law. We all assimilate to that. But I think there's a level of assimilation that's it's self-dissociation, it's self-abandonment, and it's not being in spaces where you're valued. What you are is valued organically, inherently. And I think that can lead to a sense that you don't have self-worth unless you're being X, Y, Z. And that can be quite challenging for the individual. And it's quite a journey to unlearn that and learn a new story and then be honest in who you are and be authentic. And I think when you live in that space where you do what you're great at, you do what you believe in, and you use your skills and strengths in the way that you want to, in the way that feels like natural, if you're following your own inspiration, you'll be successful and a success that means something to you. And that doesn't feel like a Pyrrhic win.
Anything you would, through your experiences, any recommendations for organizations who could do it better? I always do give recommendation to organizations if I don't feel welcomed. Sometimes, you just don't feel welcomed at certain organization or event, or it can be anything. But through your experience, where do you think such, larger organizations or anything of that sort can do more and actively promote these values?
Do you know what? I don't think it's just organizations. I think one of the things I'm learning is that we're a product of the systems we exist in, and an organization is just like, maybe it's a bit that's above the water or above the waves and you can see it, but underneath the waves is like a plethora of other things going on. I think like we live in systems that value certain things. They value certain people over time. We live in systems that have a lot of tropes. I used to love watching movies, like all kinds of movies from all different cultures. I still do, to be fair. But often you find that they've got the same narrative. You could watch any movie, like I watch Bollywood movies all the time, and then I'll watch Nollywood movies, then I'll be watching a Hollywood movie, and there's the same tropes. And I think they're these stories that we've been told, and they're so unconscious that it's hard to even realize that it's a bias. And everyone has them to some degree. And even people who are othered in the system, like let's say you're Black in a group where there's all white people, and maybe you're a woman in a space that's all men and engineers and so on, you'll notice that you also have those ideas, that you're also like self-inhibiting, self-limiting. So I realized it's not just about the organizations, it's about the wider collective consciousness. And I guess maybe that sounds a bit woo-woo, but I think that's the real thing that we're trying to shift. It's not just individual consciousness, it's collective consciousness. And that could be in the media we watch. So maybe the media we watch needs to be a little bit more nuanced in the portrayal of people. Even I always used to love watching Scandal. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a great show with Olivia. Olivia Pope's the character, but she's played by Kerry Washington, the actress. And she acts as a handler for the US, presidency, and like all the behind the scene of where power happens, right? And I love Shonda Rhimes, who's kind of the mind behind it all, and her intent was to change the narrative that was negative around Black women, maybe being poor performing or hypersexual, or some of the negative tropes that have been throughout history that have been useful to control narratives and control people, to one that was powerful and empowering. You can do it. You're so successful, like Black excellence, Black girl magic, etc., etc. But then the irony is that also creates another issue that's the only representation that exists. That's the only way someone can exist in spaces, is to be thoroughly excellent. When actually, if I look around in spaces that I exist in, there are people who don't have my qualifications, my level of experience, whatever, and we're compared like because I have to be extraordinary to be in the same space as someone who's just exists by themselves. And I think that often creates other problems. So I think it's changing collective consciousness, and media has a part to play in that, but it's also getting that media right. And even when we do, even if the intent is right, like the example of Shonda Rhimes and Scandal and Olivia Pope, we often create other problems, and we don't know what the unintended consequences are. So it's more like we won't get it right, but we can iterate through it. Just like a scientist, you try it, you experiment, maybe it doesn't work. But with consciousness and people collectively, it takes a long time for that change to happen. So when you get it wrong, by the time you got everyone to think something new, it could be 50 years, and you've got to kind of pivot on that. But I think I wouldn't say it's just organizations. I'd say it's more about collective consciousness and changing that deep internal story that we all have globally picked up over time, that seems to show up everywhere. And it kind of is the real motivator behind our actions, but the kind of unconscious one that's actually motivating us and moving us forward, but not in the way that we want to.
I could hear you out all the time. I think you have some really good perspectives and very firm ones. But just you mentioned something about global, and I'll just take the conversation from to a lot more global perspective on a wide variety of environmental challenges. So in your experience, how do you look at environmental challenges and solutions vary across different regions in the world and maybe different cultures as well? And what can we learn from these diverse perspectives? If you know of any global solution which you have looked at in the world and you're like, oh wow, you know what, this is exactly something what I needed to take inspiration from.
I think you're right that we do need to look at it from a global perspective, but I also think that there needs to be a devolved approach to it, right? Because there's an element that sometimes a solution that works elsewhere doesn't work in another community, because there's like maybe nuances that don't that doesn't translate. So when I try and think about this, I try and think about sustainability and the goals we're trying to achieve through the global goals, like the UN SDG goals, the 17 goals to change the world. And then I try and think about how do we apply some of the initiatives elsewhere, but through a localized lens and led locally. So that's kind of why I like some of those community grassroots efforts, because often they do rely for the globalized and the localized lens. Like I remember reading about Diamond in Louisiana, and it was kind of paraphrases Cancer Alley, because it's where all these big corporations kind of produced mass petrochemicals with no limits, and it absolutely destroyed the community there. They were all sick, and there was actually a campaign led locally by a teacher that got the voice of the people, that executed the problems perfectly. And often you need local leaders who understand the nuance of the problem, who understand the pain point, and can then be the advocates for global change. But that issue of air quality and so on is a global one. You can go to London and look at, Deborah Adewusi, I think the 11-year-old who's the first person ever in history, in the UK at least, to die and have air quality put down on her coroner's report as the cause of death. That's still the same problem, but the solution will need a localized lens. So one that considers, okay, in Lewisham in London, what are the issues here? What's the air quality issue? Okay, is it big vans they're parking here? Is it actually a certain community that's being targeted by the negative changes? For example, that's a very diverse community. So how do we make sure that there is an unequal burden of environmental consequences on these local communities? Then you go to Diamond Alley in Louisiana in the US, and that case study, the solution there is someone who understands the challenges, who has case studies on what the consequences have happened, and is able to then rally people around them and make a good case that can change the course of history. So it's understanding what the global problem is, like the UN SDG goals are a great framework for that, but it's also understanding that there's a localized twang to some of these problems, and it needs local voices in it. And I do sometimes worry when I see some movements and initiatives that have a global north approach to global south approach, which often feels very reminiscent of how we got to some of the challenges we have in the world. It can feel like a very colonizing approach, and can still feel with that energy. So I often think it needs a localized approach, because some of the people who are facing the consequences of our lack of action when it comes to the environment and sustainability are minority groups, are socioeconomically poor groups, and are people in the global south. And the approach has to be led with them in mind, or led with their voices. Otherwise, it's problematic.
Definitely, completely agree to that. And I do feel we need to have localized approach, and that's where we can take it much more globally, where people can take inspiration and find problems in their local region and then come up with solutions. And I do feel this is where communities can come together in addressing problems, challenges, and coming up with solutions. And that's where, that's the power of community. And we're building this global community who are all eco warriors in making a long-term, larger impact. So, firstly, thank you so much for being on with us. One last final question. How can our listeners support and get involved in the work you're doing? Or is there any similar initiatives which you would like people to get involved in?
Well, practically, if anyone is trying to do something positive in the environmental space, I will so signpost them to Surfers Against Sewage, because I think Surfers Against Sewage is a great charity, and it has some really good tools practically to go from having maybe no knowledge about this to taking action against sewage pollution, plastic pollution, ocean recovery, and climate emergency. So I definitely throw you that way. And if you want to follow what I'm doing, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. My name's Ayo Sokale. I am on Instagram as official Ayo Sokale. So you can follow my one girl revolution to try and live with purpose and have some positive impact on the world.
We'll definitely do that, and we'll make sure to put in all the links in the podcast when we do add it. But again, thank you so much, Ayo, for joining us. Thank you so much for your perspectives. And it was great fun knowing so much about you and your perspectives as well.
Thank you so much. It's been such a fun conversation, Michelle. I really enjoyed it.